I'm Nehemiah, and I'll be your thinking partner for the day. Have you ever noticed that the political landscape can often seem turbulent? What if I told you there was a better way to do it? The first thing I'd like to break down is the categories that most government issues fall into: social issues, economic issues, and foreign policy. We're going to talk about foreign policy later. 99% of all issues will fall into those three categories. Now, first, let's take the two main parties here in the US and look at their philosophy for each category and see if it's compatible with its own value system. And I think you'll see what I mean here. Let's start with the Democrats. Democrats value freedom and liberty in relation to social issues. Examples would be pro-choice, same-sex marriage, recreational substances, the freedom of speech. Basically, they would say to the government, don't tell me how to live my life. How can that work? Some people would argue that same-sex marriage is unnatural, in the literal sense of not being able to make babies. Obviously, adoption or insemination is a way for same-sex people to have children. But the real reason someone would be wrong in making that argument is because natural selection would not be passed on if they can't have children. The natural system of evolution has solved the problem before it started. Their choice to be together doesn't affect anyone but themselves. There is no threat to the human race continuing on. So why not let people do what they want if there's no harm to anyone else? Letting evolution, natural selection, and survival of the fittest do its work naturally sorts out the unsustainable value systems. Notice I didn't say invalid. The government doesn't need to control individuals because cause and effect will sort them out. We need some laws like you can't murder people, but if you aren't hurting anyone but yourself, by all means, hurt yourself. Even though this can seem counterintuitive, I personally agree with Democrats' view on social freedom in most cases. However, their value system on economical issues is totally different. It's more about government control of businesses and economics. They like regulations to make sure people aren't taken advantage of. They're in favor of unions. They want strict rules on how businesses sell things to make sure that they're safe. And they want the government to bail out big businesses so people don't lose their jobs if the company can't sustain. The list goes on and on about how they want the government to be in more control over businesses and the economy. Healthcare, schools, welfare, all these fall into this category because they all mean that the government needs to ask for more money from the country's taxpayers to pay for those services, which in turn means that everyone has less spending money, which means they spend less money, which in turn means that most businesses are getting less money, which means they fire people, give out less hours, which means that there are less people with jobs, which means that less businesses do even worse. So the process repeats itself, and so we have another Great Depression. So let me ask you this question. If their value system is valid for the social issues, why would they change it for the economical ones? Should we let businesses fail if they're making low-quality products for too much money? Wouldn't it be better to let them fail to make room for new ones that have better ideas, better products, or prices? In other words, shouldn't we let evolution, natural selection, and survival of the fittest do its work to sort out good businesses from bad? For example, if a company was dumping toxic waste into a river and causing all kinds of problems for the environment, wildlife, and humans, wouldn't it be motivated to change their behaviors once word gets out? Which is why freedom of speech is so important. We'll more on that later in a different video. If you heard that a company was doing these things, you would stop buying products from them. And you wouldn't be the only person changing your buying habits. So they're forced through natural selection to adapt to public opinion or go out of business. It's no coincidence that most economic professors are pro-free market. They have seen this at play in the economy on a daily basis. Maybe it will take more convincing to persuade you into thinking that a free market is the best way to conduct business. It's not perfect by any means, but nothing is. Throughout human history, we have looked for better ways to do it, but they don't factor in the human nature, the way that the universe works. On paper, communism looks great, but in practice, it's miserable for everyone. Look at North Korea and South Korea. North Korea is a communist country, and South Korea is a capitalist. Where would you prefer to live? That doesn't mean that people in South Korea live in heaven. They're bombarded by advertising and marketing nonstop, like we are here in the US. But it's a small price to pay for having a huge increase in quality of life for its citizens. The point is, the Democratic Party is a paradox in its own right. Even with nothing to compare it to, it doesn't make sense to have two completely opposing views be a part of the same system. Now, before I lose my Democrat friends who might be screaming at their screen right now, let's turn our attention to the big bad Republicans. Their economic views are nearly perfectly in sync with free market and natural selection. And I just laid out how that works, and it's fresh in our minds. Less regulations, less tax, more freedom. Basically, they would say to the government, don't tell me how to run my business. Cool. We've seen this before, and it works. Both for the Democrats and their social freedom, and Republicans with their economic views. I'm groovy with that. But in stark contrast, their views on social issues is totally inconsistent with their own views on the economy and how the government shouldn't interfere. It's ironic, because the reason free market works so well is because it's basically at evolution in the markets. Money is like life and death in the wilderness. If you have money, you live. If you don't have money, you die. Evolution is the great life judge. Then we switch over to social issues, and they literally denounce evolution and natural selection. It's hilarious. How does forcing people to adopt religious views and values decreed from the government even make sense? Again, we look at history, and this never works. People left Europe to come to America to escape religious government. The Church of England was the government. The Roman Empire turned into a massive cult, forcing people to convert. It led us into the Dark Ages. I majored in religion and philosophy, and I grew up in the church, knowing the Bible very well. The governments twisted and misused the Bible to subvert and control. If it's a good religion, evolution, ironically, and natural selection will sort out people if they want to decide to believe in that religion or not. That is what religion is based on. It can't be forced. A single person has to choose to believe for themselves. A true Christian believer wouldn't want to force people to convert, and especially not using the government to do so. Jesus preached to follow the laws of the government and to pay taxes like normal. The real work is done in the soul. This is the crux of separation of church and state. The church shouldn't force its view onto the whole, but instead work individually. If people are convinced, they will convert one by one. If not, they are free to choose not to. Now, going back to the controversial topic of same-sex marriage, we can see how both parties are missing the real point. On the Democratic side, they're fighting for equality, perfectly fine thing to fight for, but really what they're fighting for is to be able to marry. Why? Isn't marriage a religious thing? When we were living 100,000 years ago in caves, did we marry each other? We don't have cold hard proof, but most likely not, and probably we had multiple partners to make sure we had lots of kids, to have helpers for farm work, and to make sure we didn't die out. Marriage really is a fabric of our own imagination. The problem is how it's seeped into the government. And there are now very real advantages for getting legally married, such as better taxes, inheritance laws. However, by fighting for same-sex marriages, you're adding to the validity of the religious and its power in the government. On the flip side, Republicans are fighting to force their religious views onto everyone, even if they don't believe in the same values. In the end, they're handing over control of spiritual matters to the government. They are fighting to win the battle of same-sex marriage, but in the process, they're losing the war on religious freedoms. Does the church want the government to be able to tell what the church is allowed to do? What if a different political party comes into power in the future? They have already handed over the keys to the castle, and the government now has control of what the church is allowed to do. The church should be separate and free from the government. It should be wrong for the government to allow to control churches and force them to marry people the church doesn't want to marry. But it should also be wrong for the church to force its idea of marriage into the government and let there be any advantage at all for being married. This is the real issue. In an ideal world, the church is happy because it's not being forced to perform marriages for people it doesn't want to, and everyone else is happy because there isn't prejudice in the government that is handing out benefits to religious people for doing something that should have nothing to do with the government. Same-sex couples can still commit to each other, or go to a different religious institution that is willing to perform some kind of marriage for them. The point is, everyone can do what they want and call it what they want, because we can all be and should be free. Now, I'd like to talk about the generalities of parties and putting people into groups. In reality, sometimes people can align with economic views of Republicans, but not the social ones, but still decide to be a Republican. They have just decided that the economy is more important than personal freedoms. They make a concession. Some Democrats do the same thing in reverse. They align with the personal freedoms, but not the government control in the economy. But they decide that personal freedoms are more important than economic ones, while everyone else tricks themselves into believing that they agree with all of the party's views, all the while living in cognitive dissonance that the party's views are contradictory. Both parties harbor double standards. No wonder there is political turbulence. We're forced to pick because there are only two popular opinions. Sure, there's independent parties, but so far they've had little footing. I'd like to change that. The solution is to change the two-party system into a four-party system. A little hyperbolic here, but stay with me. One party is called the Nazis. They want the government to control both the social and the economic issues. Another party is called the Republicans, and they want economic freedom, but social tyranny. The third one is the Democrats that want social freedom, but want economic tyranny. And lastly, the Libertarians, they want freedom from social and economical issues. They believe in natural selection, evidence, logic, and the greater good. This isn't something that I think we should just keep in our minds and not talk about. Things aren't just going to magically change one day. We have to do things about it. I think there's on the horizon waiting some kind of revolution coming. I think that especially in the young people that have access to all this information and are generally more open-minded, I think that we can really show our power as a huge group of people here in the country that are voters to rise up and ask for a better system. We're so stuck on the history, our forefathers. They got a lot of stuff right, they got a lot of stuff wrong. Times are changing. The last 200 years, the landscape of our world and how we all interact with each other is completely different. A lot of the things that applied back then and worked back then don't work now. So I'm asking you, if this interests you, if this speaks to you in any way, pass it along. Tell your friends and family about it. Again, not for the subs, not for the likes, but because of what's happening in the minds. Write to your senators, write to your representatives. Make your own videos. Talk about it with people at work when you're not on the clock. This is important. I'm asking you to do something about it.